The most expensive prison is the one built from expectations instead of walls. Adrian Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions before turning 32, rescued collapsing corporations, and transformed Whitmore Holdings into one of the most respected financial empires in America. Yet none of those victories prepared him for the document waiting in the center of the polished walnut boardroom table that morning. Sunlight poured through the towering glass windows overlooking Manhattan, illuminating the faces of board members who had already made the most important decision of his life without asking for his opinion. Adrian remained perfectly composed as his grandfather, Charles Whitmore, slid a leather folder across the table. Inside rested a formal marriage agreement bearing the seal of the Hawthorne family, another powerful dynasty whose influence stretched across banking, technology, and international investments. The proposed spouse was Preston Hawthorne, an Omega heir admired for intelligence, grace, and unwavering loyalty to family tradition. Investors believed the union would stabilize both empires for generations. Financial analysts were already predicting record market confidence, and every executive around the table viewed the marriage as another strategic merger rather than the beginning of two people's lives. Adrian quietly read every page before closing the folder with calm precision. "Has anyone in this room considered asking whether either of us actually wants this?" he asked. The question was met by respectful silence until Charles finally answered. "Some responsibilities are greater than personal preference." Adrian looked around the room, recognizing faces that had applauded every achievement of his career while expecting absolute obedience in return. He had spent 12 years proving himself worthy of leading the company, sacrificing friendships, relationships, weekends, and every ordinary moment most people considered part of a meaningful life. Now the reward for that dedication was a future designed entirely by someone else. Hours later, Adrian attended a private dinner hosted by the Hawthorne family inside a historic estate, overlooking Boston Harbor. Preston greeted him with flawless courtesy, dressed elegantly and carrying the same restrained composure Adrian saw reflected in his own life. Once the formal introductions ended, they found themselves standing beside a quiet garden fountain while the families discussed business inside. Preston offered a faint smile that carried more understanding than excitement. "Everyone keeps congratulating us," he said softly. "It feels strange when neither of us has celebrated anything." Adrian nodded. "Do you ever wonder whether they are protecting our future or simply protecting their own expectations?" Preston looked toward the evening sky before answering. Every day, there was no bitterness between them. Only the shared realization that they had become symbols of stability instead of individuals with dreams of their own. Before returning to the ballroom, Preston quietly added, "Whatever happens, I hope one day both of us get to make at least one important decision for ourselves." The word stayed with Adrian throughout the drive back to New York. By midnight, the official engagement announcement had already appeared across financial news outlets. Social media celebrated the alliance between two legendary families, and congratulatory messages filled every screen in his apartment. Adrian stood alone beside the panoramic windows overlooking the glittering skyline, holding the signed agreement in one hand while the city stretched endlessly below. He had everything people spent entire lifetimes chasing, yet an unfamiliar emptiness settled quietly inside him. For the first time, success no longer felt like freedom. It felt like a beautifully decorated cage whose door had been locked long before he ever realized he was living inside it. 3 days after the engagement announcement, Adrian Whitmore accepted a site inspection that had remained untouched on his calendar for months. Officially, Whitmore Holdings had recently acquired a historic lakeside resort in Vermont, and the executive board wanted every architectural detail restored before reopening the property as an exclusive destination. Normally, Adrian would have delegated the inspection to senior management, but after days filled with interviews, formal dinners, and carefully rehearsed smiles, the trip offered something he desperately needed. It offered distance. As his car left Manhattan behind, towering skyscrapers gradually disappeared into rolling hills, quiet highways, and endless forests dressed in late autumn colors. His phone continued filling with messages from lawyers, assistants, and event planners discussing wedding arrangements, public appearances, and investment opportunities connected to the engagement, yet he silenced every notification and simply watched the peaceful landscape unfolding beyond the windshield. When Adrian finally arrived at the resort, restoration crews were already examining weathered timber beams and carefully documenting every original architectural feature. The project manager welcomed him with rolled blueprints beneath one arm before leading him toward the grand entrance where an aging oak staircase dominated the lobby. Despite decades of use, every carved railing still reflected remarkable craftsmanship. The manager explained that local preservation authorities had approved the restoration only if the staircase was repaired by an experienced artisan familiar with traditional woodworking methods. "There is only one workshop everyone recommends," he said confidently. Curious, Adrian agreed to visit immediately. 20 minutes later, he parked outside Brooks Woodcraft, a modest workshop standing beside a quiet country road surrounded by colorful maple trees. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating shelves filled with antique furniture, handcrafted cabinets, and beautifully restored wooden pieces carrying the warmth of generations. The gentle scent of fresh cedar and polished oak welcomed him before anyone spoke. Inside, a young Korean Omega worked patiently at a large wooden table, carefully restoring an antique chair with calm concentration. Fine traces of sawdust rested across his light linen shirt and work apron, yet every precise movement reflected years of dedication to his craft. Hearing footsteps, the young man looked up and smiled naturally. "Welcome. Give me one moment. I never leave a piece unfinished in the middle of a repair." Adrian waited quietly, surprised by the absence of formality. When the craftsman finally approached, he extended his hand without hesitation. "I am Caleb Brooks." Adrian accepted the handshake. "I am Adrian." Caleb simply nodded, completely unaware that he was speaking with one of the wealthiest executives in America. "So, Adrian, what brings you all the way out here?" The ordinary question caught him off guard because nobody had addressed him without mentioning his title in years. Adrian glanced toward the carefully restored furniture surrounding them. "I came because I was told you could save an old staircase." Caleb smiled gently before resting one hand upon a weathered oak beam leaning against the workshop wall. "Old wood usually does not need someone to save it," he replied. "It only needs someone willing to understand what it has survived." Those simple words lingered in Adrian's thoughts far longer than any corporate presentation he had attended. Throughout the afternoon, Caleb explained traditional restoration techniques with quiet enthusiasm, while Adrian found himself asking questions unrelated to budgets or deadlines. For the first time in many years, no one expected flawless leadership, perfect answers, or impossible decisions from him. There were only warm rays of afternoon sunlight, the comforting sound of woodworking tools, and an ordinary conversation that somehow felt more genuine than every elegant celebration waiting for him back in New York. As Adrian prepared to leave, Caleb smiled warmly and said, "Drive safely. I hope the staircase turns out exactly the way you imagine." Adrian thanked him before walking toward his car, unaware that this unexpected meeting had quietly become the first moment in his life when duty began losing its hold over his heart. Adrian told himself the second trip to Vermont was purely about inspecting the restoration project, but the excuse felt less convincing with every mile he drove away from New York. His executive assistant had already informed him that the construction team could provide detailed reports through video conferences, and the board expected him to remain in Manhattan to prepare for the engagement celebration. Even so, Adrian quietly rearranged his schedule and returned to the peaceful town that had occupied his thoughts ever since his first visit. When he stepped inside Brooks Woodcraft once again, the familiar scent of cedar, oak, and freshly polished timber immediately replaced the cold atmosphere of executive offices and conference rooms. Caleb looked up from an antique cabinet he was carefully restoring and smiled with the same quiet warmth that Adrian remembered. "I was beginning to think the city had claimed you forever," Caleb said with a gentle laugh. Adrian smiled before answering. "It almost did." Caleb invited him deeper into the workshop and placed a pair of protective gloves on the workbench. "If you are going to inspect my work again, you should probably help instead of standing there." Adrian accepted the gloves with an amused expression. "You trust me with something this valuable?" Caleb rested one hand on an old oak beam. "Wood remembers patience better than perfection. If you listen before you act, you will probably do just fine." Throughout the afternoon, Caleb patiently demonstrated traditional restoration techniques, while Adrian followed each instruction with genuine curiosity. Together, they cleaned carved railings, repaired delicate joints, and examined the natural grain running through every piece of timber. No one interrupted them with urgent emails, market reports, or shareholder meetings. Hours passed so naturally that Adrian barely noticed the time. Around lunchtime, Caleb suggested they walk to a small diner near the lake. The waitress greeted Caleb by name before serving homemade soup and fresh sandwiches without asking what he usually ordered. Local residents smiled politely as they passed the table, discussing the upcoming harvest festival and the first signs of autumn across the mountains. Nobody recognized Adrian as the leader of one of the country's largest corporations. Nobody expected him to solve impossible business problems. For the first time in years, he enjoyed an entire meal without reaching for his phone. Caleb noticed the untouched device beside Adrian's coffee cup and smiled quietly. That thing has not stopped lighting up all afternoon. Adrian glanced toward the screen filled with missed calls and unread messages before placing it back into his pocket. For once, none of it feels urgent. Caleb looked through the restaurant window toward the calm lake shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. Sometimes people spend so much energy building successful lives that they forget to build peaceful ones. Adrian remained silent because the words felt uncomfortably true. Later, they returned to the lakeside resort to inspect the restored staircase beneath the golden light of early evening. Standing together on the porch overlooking the quiet water, Adrian realized he had not thought about stock prices or board meetings for several hours. Instead, he found himself appreciating the simple satisfaction of watching someone restore beauty instead of chasing power. Just then his phone vibrated again. This time the caller was Charles Whitmore. Adrian answered calmly. His grandfather informed him that the engagement gala had been moved forward, and every member of both families expected his presence in New York the following morning. After the brief conversation ended, Adrian slowly lowered the phone and looked back toward Caleb, who remained focused on the peaceful landscape without knowing that another world was already demanding Adrian return. As the sun disappeared beyond the mountains, Adrian quietly understood that every journey back to Vermont made it harder to convince himself that his future still belonged in Manhattan. The engagement gala transformed one of Manhattan's most elegant hotels into a celebration of perfection. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while a string quartet performed beneath towering arrangements of white flowers, and every major financial publication in the country sent reporters to witness what they described as the alliance of a generation. Adrian Whitmore stood beside Preston Hawthorne wearing a perfectly tailored formal suit, greeting investors, government officials, and longtime family friends with the calm professionalism everyone expected from him. Camera flashes captured every handshake, every polite smile, and every carefully arranged photograph. To the outside world, they appeared to be two people beginning a remarkable future together. Only Adrian and Preston understood that they were simply fulfilling expectations created long before either of them had been allowed to choose their own path. During a brief pause in the evening, Preston quietly suggested they step onto a private balcony overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Cool autumn air replaced the warmth of the crowded ballroom as the sounds of conversation faded behind the closed doors. Preston rested his hands upon the stone railing before speaking. Something changed after your trip to Vermont. Adrian looked toward the distant lights stretching across the city. What makes you think that? Preston smiled gently. Because when we first met, you looked like someone who had already accepted his future. Tonight you look like someone wondering whether another future exists. Adrian remained silent for several moments before answering honestly. I met someone who reminded me what an ordinary life feels like. Preston nodded without surprise. Sometimes ordinary is far more extraordinary than people realize. Before either of them could continue, Charles Whitmore approached with two senior board members. The media would like another series of photographs, he said calmly. After that, both families will hold a private meeting. Less than an hour later, Adrian entered an executive conference room reserved exclusively for the Whitmore and Hawthorne families. Thick folders rested neatly before every seat. Charles opened one and quietly slid several pages across the polished table. Adrian immediately recognized photographs of Brooks Woodcraft, visitor records from the Vermont project, and detailed summaries documenting every trip he had made to the resort after signing the engagement agreement. One Hawthorne executive folded his hands before speaking. "Your repeated visits have attracted unnecessary attention." Adrian answered evenly. "The visits were connected to the restoration project." Another executive responded without emotion. "Public perception rarely separates business from personal relationships." Charles looked directly at his grandson. "To avoid future misunderstandings, another executive will supervise the Vermont development. Effective immediately, you will no longer oversee that project." Adrian slowly closed the folder. He understood the real purpose behind the decision. Nobody in the room cared about construction schedules. They cared about removing every reason for him to return to Vermont. The meeting ended with polite agreement from everyone except Adrian. Late that evening, he returned to his apartment overlooking the city and noticed a single message waiting on his phone. It was from Caleb, thanking him for trusting the workshop with such an important restoration and explaining that the staircase was progressing exactly as planned. The message was simple, thoughtful, and completely unaware of the discussions taking place hundreds of miles away. Adrian read it several times before looking out across the glowing skyline. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, he realized the greatest threat to everything he had built was not a competitor, a recession, or a failed investment. It was the growing certainty that the quiet workshop in Vermont already felt more like home than the magnificent empire he had spent his entire life protecting. Several days passed without another message from Adrian, and Caleb quietly assumed the demands of corporate life had finally pulled him back into the world where he truly belonged. Brooks Woodcraft remained as peaceful as ever, filled with the comforting rhythm of sanding wood, restoring antique furniture, and welcoming longtime customers from neighboring towns. Caleb focused on completing the lakeside staircase before the first snowfall arrived, believing that every project deserved his full attention regardless of who had commissioned it. One gray afternoon, a black luxury sedan stopped outside the workshop. Two professionally dressed representatives introduced themselves as consultants from Whitmore Holdings conducting a routine review of the restoration contract. Their questions, however, had little to do with timber quality or construction schedules. They politely asked how often Adrian had visited, whether he had remained after working hours, and what topics they usually discussed. Caleb answered honestly that most of their conversations centered on woodworking, local history, and the restoration itself. When the visitors finally departed, an uneasy feeling settled quietly over the workshop. Nothing they had said sounded openly threatening, yet everything about the conversation suggested that someone was trying to understand far more than a construction project. Hundreds of miles away in Manhattan, Adrian found himself trapped inside an endless sequence of meetings preparing for the official wedding ceremony. Designers presented venue layouts, attorneys reviewed financial agreements, public relations advisors coordinated interviews, and every decision seemed to reinforce a future that felt increasingly distant from the life he wanted. During one strategy session, Charles Whitmore calmly informed the executive team that another vice president would permanently oversee every remaining phase of the Vermont development. Adrian immediately understood the message hidden beneath the announcement. His family had not merely reassigned a project. They had carefully removed the only legitimate reason he still had to visit Vermont. That evening, Adrian called the resort manager, hoping to receive an update on the restoration. Instead, he learned that Caleb had politely requested another supervisor handle all future communication because he believed the company preferred greater professional distance. Adrian ended the call feeling an unfamiliar weight settle across his thoughts. The following weekend, Caleb walked alone along the quiet lakeside after finishing another day inside the workshop. The restored staircase stood beautifully against the historic lodge, nearly complete and ready to welcome future guests. Looking across the calm water, he remembered Adrian asking thoughtful questions about old wood, craftsmanship, and ordinary life. Caleb smiled faintly before reminding himself that people from different worlds sometimes crossed paths only briefly. He respected Adrian enough not to become another complication in an already complicated life. The next morning, Adrian received a handwritten envelope delivered to his office. Inside rested a simple thank you card from Brooks Woodcraft expressing appreciation for the opportunity to restore such an important landmark. Folded neatly beneath the note was a small photograph of the completed staircase glowing beneath warm afternoon sunlight. On the back, Caleb had written only one sentence: "Some places remain meaningful even after the journey ends." Adrian stared at those words for several quiet minutes before carefully placing the photograph inside his briefcase instead of filing it with company records. At that moment, he realized the greatest distance between himself and Caleb was no longer measured in miles between New York and Vermont. It was measured by every silent decision he continued making without fighting for the life he genuinely wanted. The morning after receiving Caleb's handwritten note, Adrian arrived at Whitmore Holdings long before the first executive meeting. The photograph of the restored staircase remained inside his briefcase, tucked carefully between financial reports that suddenly felt meaningless beside a single image of honest craftsmanship. Before the building had fully awakened, Adrian walked directly into his grandfather's office. Charles Whitmore looked up from several documents and immediately recognized the determination on his grandson's face. Adrian quietly placed the photograph on the desk. "I want to know why my personal life has become another corporate investigation." Charles studied the photograph before answering calmly. "Because every decision made by the future leader of this family affects thousands of employees, shareholders, and generations that follow." Adrian met his grandfather's gaze without hesitation. "Caleb Brooks has done nothing except restore our property with integrity." Charles folded his hands together. "This has never been about him. It is about protecting everything our family has spent decades building." Adrian slowly nodded. "Perhaps that is exactly the problem. We have spent so much time protecting the company that we forgot how to protect the people inside it." Neither man raised his voice, yet the conversation carried more weight than any argument could have achieved. Later that afternoon, Adrian accepted an invitation from Preston to meet privately at the Hawthorne estate before another round of wedding planning began. They walked through a quiet greenhouse filled with seasonal flowers, far away from advisors and photographers. Preston noticed Adrian's thoughtful expression almost immediately. "You have already made a decision, have you not?" Adrian answered honestly. "I have only realized that I cannot continue pretending nothing has changed." Preston smiled with quiet understanding. "Then perhaps we have reached the same place by different roads." Adrian looked at him with curiosity. Preston stopped beside a small fountain before speaking again. "Everyone assumes I am excited because I have never objected. The truth is much simpler. I stayed silent because disappointing my family seemed easier than disappointing myself." Adrian remained silent, allowing Preston to continue. "Meeting you confirmed something important. You are not searching for an escape from responsibility. You are searching for a life that feels real." Adrian slowly removed Caleb's photograph from his jacket and looked at the completed staircase once more. "I met someone who measures success differently." Preston studied the picture before returning it with a gentle smile. "Then do not lose him because other people measured your future for you." Those words lingered long after they returned inside the estate. Hundreds of miles away, Caleb carefully locked Brooks Woodcraft after completing the final inspection of the lakeside staircase. The project manager congratulated him on delivering one of the finest restorations the resort had ever commissioned and casually mentioned that another executive would now oversee the property. Caleb thanked him politely, although the news quietly confirmed everything he had already suspected. The chapter connecting him to Adrian had finally reached its end. That evening, he informed his father that he intended to accept a temporary restoration contract in another state once the current project officially closed. He believed leaving for a while would allow life to return to normal for everyone involved. At nearly the same moment, Adrian stood alone inside his apartment overlooking Manhattan. The engagement contract rested on one side of the table, while Caleb's photograph rested on the other. For the first time, he did not see two unrelated objects. He saw two completely different futures waiting for the same decision, and he finally understood that remaining silent was no longer the safest choice. It was the only choice guaranteed to make him lose the life he truly wanted. The following morning, Adrian walked into the quarterly executive board meeting, carrying two envelopes instead of the usual stack of financial reports. Every senior director from Whitmore Holdings had gathered to finalize the timeline for the wedding, approve the next phase of the Hawthorne partnership, and announce the leadership transition that would accompany the marriage. The atmosphere inside the boardroom reflected absolute confidence, as though every important decision had already been settled. Adrian quietly waited until the final presentation concluded before standing from his chair. Every conversation stopped immediately. Charles Whitmore looked toward his grandson with calm expectation. Adrian placed the first envelope on the polished conference table. "This is my formal request to terminate the marriage agreement." Before anyone could respond, he placed the second envelope beside it. "And this is my resignation as Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Holdings, effective after an orderly leadership transition." Complete silence filled the room. Several board members exchanged stunned glances, while others simply stared at the documents without speaking. One senior executive finally broke the silence. "Adrian, you are prepared to abandon everything you have built?" Adrian answered with quiet confidence. "No, I am choosing not to abandon the person I have become while building it." Charles slowly opened the resignation letter before raising his eyes toward Adrian. "You understand the consequences of this decision?" Adrian nodded. "For the first time in my life, I understand the consequences of not making it." Before another discussion could begin, the conference room doors opened, and Preston entered carrying a folder of his own. He had been invited to join the meeting later that morning, unaware of Adrian's announcement. After seeing the two envelopes on the table, he looked toward Adrian and quietly smiled. Without hesitation, Preston placed his own signed statement beside the marriage agreement. "I also request that the engagement be dissolved," he said respectfully. "This partnership was created to strengthen two families. It should never require two people to surrender their futures." No one argued with anger. Even Charles remained silent, recognizing that forcing either young man forward would preserve appearances while destroying trust forever. The meeting ended not with celebration or applause, but with a quiet understanding that an era had come to its natural conclusion. Later that afternoon, Adrian returned to his apartment, packed only a few personal belongings into 2 travel bags, and left the framed awards, executive photographs, and trophies exactly where they had always stood. Looking around the empty rooms one final time, he realized none of those accomplishments had ever made the apartment feel like home. Several hours later, he boarded the first available flight to Vermont carrying nothing except a small suitcase, and Caleb's photograph carefully protected inside his jacket. Meanwhile, Caleb loaded woodworking tools into the back of an old pickup truck outside Brooks Woodcraft. The temporary restoration contract in another state would begin the following morning, and he believed leaving quietly was the kindest choice for everyone. Just as he prepared to close the workshop doors, the sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway interrupted the peaceful afternoon. Caleb looked toward the entrance and saw Adrian stepping out of a rental vehicle with travel bags in his hands instead of a business briefcase. Neither of them spoke immediately. The autumn wind carried colorful leaves between them, while months of unspoken emotions filled the silence. Finally, Caleb smiled gently, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. "I thought you had a wedding to prepare for." Adrian met his eyes with complete certainty before answering the only words that truly mattered. "Not anymore. I finally chose the life that was waiting for me instead of the one everyone else had already planned." Adrian remained standing in the gravel driveway as the afternoon breeze carried the scent of cedar through the trees surrounding Brooks Woodcraft. For several quiet moments, neither he nor Caleb moved. The silence felt strangely comfortable, as though both of them understood that the most important conversations rarely began with hurried words. Caleb finally looked toward the 2 travel bags resting beside Adrian's rental vehicle. "You really left everything behind," he said softly. Adrian smiled with quiet certainty. "Not everything. I left the life everyone else built for me. I kept the one I still wanted to build." Caleb searched Adrian's expression, hoping to find even the smallest trace of hesitation, but there was none. Instead, he saw a calm confidence that had never existed during their earlier conversations. Before Caleb could respond, the workshop door opened and his father stepped outside carrying a weathered toolbox. He paused after recognizing Adrian, then walked toward him with the same quiet kindness that had always filled the workshop. "Welcome back," he said warmly. "This time you are not here because of a business contract." Adrian shook his head. "No, I came because this is the first place where I ever felt like myself." Caleb's father smiled gently before returning inside, leaving the two of them alone once again. During the following weeks, Adrian rented a modest lakeside cottage only a short drive from Brooks Woodcraft. Without board meetings, shareholder conferences, or carefully managed schedules controlling every hour of his day, he slowly adjusted to an entirely different rhythm of life. Each morning began with fresh coffee, quiet mountain air, and long hours inside the workshop learning traditional woodworking techniques from Caleb. At first, Adrian struggled with simple tasks. His measurements were not always accurate. Sanding required more patience than he expected, and he occasionally assembled components in the wrong order. Every mistake made Caleb laugh, and before long Adrian found himself laughing as well. It was the first time in years that failure carried no financial consequences and no public headlines. It simply became another lesson. As autumn gradually turned toward winter, the restored lakeside resort officially reopened to guests. Visitors admired the beautifully preserved oak staircase without realizing it represented far more than exceptional craftsmanship. For Adrian, it had quietly become the place where his life first changed direction. News from New York slowly became less frequent. Whitmore Holdings announced an orderly leadership transition, and financial markets remained stable under temporary executive leadership. To Adrian's surprise, the empire he had believed depended entirely upon him continued moving forward without interruption. One snowy evening, Preston called to congratulate him. His voice carried genuine warmth instead of regret. Preston explained that he had accepted a leadership position within the Hawthorne Foundation, focusing on historic preservation projects and supporting skilled artisans across the country. "Perhaps both of us finally found the future we were supposed to have," he said with a quiet laugh. Adrian thanked him sincerely, grateful that honesty had given both of them a second chance rather than leaving either trapped by expectations. After the call ended, Adrian walked outside where fresh snow covered the quiet shoreline beside the lake. Caleb soon joined him carrying 2 warm mugs of coffee. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply watched gentle snowflakes settle across the frozen dock and surrounding pine trees. Finally, Caleb looked toward Adrian with a peaceful smile. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Adrian glanced toward the softly glowing lights of the workshop before answering. "I miss the people who cared about me. I do not miss pretending that success and happiness were the same thing." Standing together beneath the quiet winter sky, both men understood they were no longer trying to escape the lives they had left behind. They were patiently building a new one together, one ordinary day at a time. 3 years passed with the quiet confidence that only honest work could create. Brooks Woodcraft had grown from a respected neighborhood workshop into one of the most admired restoration studios in New England, welcoming homeowners, architects, and preservation experts who believed historic craftsmanship deserved to be protected rather than replaced. Visitors often traveled hundreds of miles to see the workshop where forgotten staircases, antique furniture, and weathered timber found new life through patience and skill. Adrian no longer introduced himself as a former chief executive officer because that title no longer defined who he had become. Instead, he greeted every customer alongside Caleb, carrying lumber, measuring beams, preparing finishes, and teaching apprentices that every piece of wood deserved respect before any tool touched its surface. Their lives followed a peaceful rhythm built upon ordinary moments that once seemed impossible to imagine. Early mornings began with coffee beside the lake before the workshop opened. Afternoons echoed with the gentle sounds of woodworking and conversations shared with visitors eager to learn traditional techniques. Evenings ended on the porch overlooking quiet forests where changing seasons reminded them that meaningful things were never rushed. One crisp autumn morning, an elegant black sedan arrived outside the workshop. Adrian recognized the familiar vehicle before the driver even stepped out. Charles Whitmore slowly approached, looking older than Adrian remembered, but carrying the same quiet dignity that had guided the family for decades. Caleb welcomed him inside with sincere hospitality before respectfully giving the grandfather and grandson time to speak alone. Charles carefully examined the restored furniture surrounding the workshop before smiling faintly. "I spent years believing success was measured by the size of an empire," he admitted. "Standing here today, I finally understand that success is also measured by the peace people carry inside themselves." Adrian listened without interruption. Charles reached into his coat and handed him a small envelope containing the original photograph of the lakeside staircase that Adrian had once placed upon his office desk. I kept this because I wanted to remember the day you chose your own future, Charles said quietly. I did not understand your decision then. I do now. Adrian accepted the photograph with genuine gratitude. There was no resentment left between them, only the quiet understanding that both men had grown in different ways. Before leaving, Charles shook Caleb's hand warmly and thanked him for giving his grandson something no corporation had ever managed to provide. After the car disappeared beyond the maple trees, Adrian and Caleb returned to the lakeside resort where the restored staircase still welcomed every guest who entered the historic building. Children laughed while families admired the careful craftsmanship without realizing how deeply that staircase had shaped two lives. Adrian rested one hand upon the polished oak railing and smiled. Do you remember the first thing you ever told me? Caleb nodded with a gentle laugh. Oldwood does not need someone to save it. It only needs someone willing to understand what it has survived. Adrian looked across the calm lake, reflecting brilliant autumn colors before answering softly. I thought you were talking about wood. Now I know you were talking about people too. They stood together as golden afternoon sunlight illuminated the staircase exactly as it had years before, but everything else had changed. The man who once believed duty mattered more than happiness had finally discovered that true success could never be inherited, negotiated, or purchased. It was patiently built through honesty, courage, kindness, and the freedom to choose the people who made every ordinary day feel like home.